The church was silent, except for the faint echo of hymns and the slow shuffle of grieving footsteps. American flags hung heavy in the summer air, draped over caskets of fallen soldiers whose final farewell drew generals, families, and communities together. Among the mourners was General Marcus Hall, a decorated black officer who had given more than 3 decades of his life to serving a nation that did not always serve him back. But in that silence, violence erupted. A white police officer, uninvited and armed, pushed his way through the crowd, eyes fixed not on the flag or the dead, but on General Hall. With his hand trembling, rage twisting his face, he drew his gun and pointed it directly at the general's head, in front of widows, children, veterans, and cameras. Gasps filled the air. Chaos spread like fire in dry grass. What followed would not just shake one city, but the entire nation. For the first time in American history, a police officer would be sentenced to life in prison for racially motivated violence against a black military leader, a case that tore open the wounds of racism, policing, and justice in America. The sun was merciless that morning, though it was not the kind of heat people spoke about. It was the weight of grief, the heaviness of loss, pressing down on every bowed head that stepped into St. Mary's Memorial Chapel. Inside, the pews were filled with soldiers in pressed uniforms, gold-trimmed hats resting on their laps, and families who clutched folded flags like lifelines. The air was thick with reverence. Hymns swelled against stained-glass windows that caught the morning light and spilled colors across the polished floor. This was no ordinary service. The funeral was for 3 soldiers who had died in combat overseas, young men who had not lived long enough to know what peace felt like. Their sacrifice had drawn people from across the state, grieving mothers, classmates, old comrades, strangers who came simply to honor the fallen. At the front, draped in red, white, and blue, lay the caskets. The silence was so deep it carried the weight of centuries. And then there was General Marcus Hall. Hall was a figure of quiet dignity, his shoulders squared with the discipline of years in uniform. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his skin a shade of mahogany, his medals gleaming like captured stars against his chest. For 32 years, he had worn the flag on his shoulder, through deserts, mountains, and places where death was only a heartbeat away. He had fought not just for a country that doubted him, but for the men and women beside him. As he took his place near the families of the fallen, eyes followed him, some with admiration, some with resentment. He was not just a soldier, he was a symbol. To many Black Americans, he represented the proof that they, too, belonged in the highest ranks of honor. But to others, poisoned by prejudice, he was a target, a challenge to their idea of who should carry power and pride. That morning, hatred walked in through the chapel doors. Kent Doyle was not invited. He was not a veteran, nor a friend of the fallen, nor a man with any reason to be inside that sacred hall of mourning. He was a police officer in his late 40s, with the kind of weathered face that came not from wisdom, but from years of bitterness. His uniform was pressed, his badge shining, but there was a storm behind his pale blue eyes. Doyle had been suspended twice for misconduct. He had a history of aggressive policing in Black neighborhoods, his name whispered with anger in households where fear of the badge ran deep. But the department always found a way to protect him, always another excuse, always another shield. That morning, he walked in with purpose, his hand never straying far from the gun at his hip. His boots struck the chapel floor with a heavy finality, disturbing the quiet like thunder in the middle of prayer. People turned, some frowned, recognizing his face from the news, Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was wrong. And then, his eyes found General Hall. The confrontation. It happened so quickly the human mind almost refused to believe it. Doyle cut through the rows of mourners, ignoring the gasps that trailed him. His jaw clenched, his breathing uneven. He stopped just feet from General Hall. "Traitor," he spat, his voice low but venomous. Before anyone could react, his hand gripped the pistol at his waist. The sound of the weapon being drawn was deafening in the chapel. In one motion, Doyle raised his gun and aimed it directly at the general's head, in front of widows, children, veterans, and cameras. Gasps filled the air. Chaos spread like fire in dry grass. What followed would not just shake one city, but the entire nation. For the first time in American history, a police officer would be sentenced to life in prison for racially motivated violence against a black military leader, a case that tore open the wounds of racism, policing, and justice in America. The confrontation between General Hall and Kent Doyle happened so fast it was almost as if time had stopped around them. For a split second, the entire chapel was frozen in a disbelieving tableau. Doyle's face was a mask of red blotchy rage, his eyes bulging with anger and fear. His hand trembled against the gun, yet somehow managed to hold it steady at the general's head. Hall, on the other hand, was unmoving despite the hardship he had faced in his life. He stood tall, his dark eyes locked on Doyle's and wavering. It was not fear that filled him, but something else, the quiet fury of a man who had stared down enemies on foreign soil and would not cower before a coward in his own homeland. "Put the gun down," Hall said, his voice steady, commanding, the voice of a leader who had carried men through fire and chaos. But Doyle's hands shook, not with hesitation, but with rage. "You don't belong here. You never did. You people don't deserve—" He never finished the sentence. Two soldiers, quick as lightning, surged forward. One slammed his shoulder into Doyle's ribs, the other twisted his wrist until the gun clattered onto the marble floor. The sound of metal against stone rang like a bell of deliverance. Gasps turned to shouts. The chaos escalated, people rushing, crying, praying, clinging to one another. But in the center of the storm, Hall remained still, his face unreadable, as the officers who had attended the funeral rushed in to cuff Doyle. And so it was that at a funeral meant to honor the dead, America was forced to witness a sickness still alive. A white police officer, blinded by hate, pointing a gun at a black general who had given his life to serving the flag they both wore. Doyle struggled as they pulled him back, veins bulging against his neck. "You're ruining this country. You're ruining everything," he screamed, his words cutting through the chapel like jagged glass. But no one listened. The soldiers pinned him, twisting his arms behind him, locking the cuffs tight until his protests became nothing but pathetic whimpers. The crowd watched, their grief now fused with outrage. The mothers of the fallen wept harder, not only for their sons, but for the cruelty that dared to invade their final goodbye. General Hall finally spoke, his voice carrying across the chapel. "This is not about me," he said, his gaze sweeping across the terrified faces. "This is about the poison we still allow to live among us." The words hung heavy in the air, a truth too sharp to ignore. Outside, the news vans broadcast the scene live across the nation. Within hours, the image spread, a decorated black general standing firm while a white cop was dragged out of a church in handcuffs, his face twisted with hate. America watched, America reacted, and for the first time in years, The world did not move on from the funeral. It could not. The footage replayed on every screen in America. A white police officer, hand on his gun, hatred carved into his face, aiming at a black general draped in medals. It was the kind of image that demanded a response. By evening, protests were filling streets in major cities. Hashtags flooded social media. Veterans, civil rights leaders, pastors, and ordinary citizens raised their voices as one. Justice for Hall. Justice for all. For once, the system could not bury it. The indictment. Kent Doyle was charged within 48 hours. The district attorney stood before the cameras, her jaw tight, her tone unyielding. This was not just an assault on one man, she said. It was an assault on every black soldier who has served this country, on every citizen who believes in the rule of law. Officer Doyle's actions were an act of terror, and we will try him as such. The word terror hung heavy. For years, activists had demanded that racially motivated violence by law enforcement be treated for what it was: domestic terrorism. Now, at last, the government seemed willing to listen. Doyle faced charges of attempted murder, hate crimes, unlawful use of a firearm, and domestic terrorism. He was denied bail. When he was escorted into his first court hearing, chains rattling around his wrists and ankles, a crowd outside the courthouse erupted in cheers, not for vengeance, but for the rare sight of accountability. The defense. Doyle's lawyers came prepared. They painted him as a good man under stress, a patriot who had been suffering from PTSD after years on the force. They claimed he had not meant to fire the weapon, that he had only been expressing frustration. But the evidence was damning. The cameras had caught every second: his words, his stance, his hatred aimed at one man. The trembling of his hand was not fear, it was rage. Experts testified that his safety was off, his finger hovering over the trigger. If not for the soldiers who intervened, blood would have stained the church floor. And then there was his past. Witnesses came forward, families in black neighborhoods who told stories of harassment, unlawful searches, slurs whispered during traffic stops. A pattern emerged, each testimony stitching together a portrait of a man who had long believed the badge gave him permission to hate. The general's testimony. When General Hall finally took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. He wore his uniform, not for pride, but for clarity. A visual reminder of the years he had carried a nation on his shoulders. His voice was calm, deliberate, measured. I have stood in deserts where bullets flew past my head. I have watched men die in my arms. I have faced enemies sworn to kill me for the flag I carried. But never, he paused, his gaze sweeping over the jurors. Never did I imagine I would face that kind of threat in my own country, in a house of God, from a man sworn to protect. His words were not angry. They were steady, precise, and devastating. When asked why he did not flinch, he answered simply, "Because if I flinched, he would win, and I did not serve 32 years to bow before hate." Some jurors wiped their eyes. Even the judge's gavel trembled slightly as she called for order. The gavel fell with a weight that echoed far beyond the courtroom walls. Life in prison, without the possibility of parole. The words were final, definitive, heavy with history. The silence that followed lasted only seconds before it was broken by sobs, cheers, and prayers. Veterans in uniform stood, saluting. Families of the fallen clutched each other, whispering thanks to God. General Marcus Hall sat motionless, his expression unreadable, but his eyes glistened with something between sorrow and vindication. For the first time in the nation's history, a white police officer had been sentenced to life for a racially motivated act of violence against a black man. Not just any man, but a general, a leader, a symbol of service. The streets erupt. Outside, the courthouse plaza swelled with people. The news cameras captured everything: flags waving, chants rising, strangers embracing. "Justice for Hall," they shouted. "Justice for all." The chants rolled like thunder down the city blocks, echoing across neighborhoods where justice had always felt out of reach. Mothers who had buried sons taken by police violence wept openly, clutching photographs of their children. Veterans stood side by side, their salutes sharp and unwavering, a rare moment of unity bridging generations and races. In that crowd, some carried handmade signs. "Hate has no badge." Others held portraits of Dr. King, Malcolm X, Rosa Parks, linking the moment to a legacy of struggle that stretched back centuries. For once, the chant was not just a plea, it was a victory cry. The cop behind bars. Kent Doyle's face was plastered on every screen. No longer the officer with a badge, he was now a prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, shackled at the wrists and ankles, eyes downcast. His booking photo told the story: a man consumed by hate, now caged by the very system he once used as a weapon. In prison, there would be no sympathy. Corrections officers whispered about him with disdain. Inmates, many of them men he had once arrested, recognized him immediately. For the first time in his life, Doyle would taste the fear he had inflicted on others. General Hall speaks. A week after the verdict, General Hall stood before microphones at a press conference. The room was packed. Journalists, activists, veterans, families of the fallen. He wore his uniform once again, not out of pride, but because it had become the symbol of the struggle itself. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but heavy. "This was never about me," he began. "It was about the countless men and women whose names never made it to the headlines. It was about the mothers who never saw justice, the fathers who were buried without answers, the children who grew up believing the law was not meant for them. What happened in that courtroom was justice. But justice for one man does not heal the wounds of a nation." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room. "We must carry this moment forward. We must demand not just punishment, but change. If a general in uniform can have a gun pointed at his head in a house of God, then what hope is there for the ordinary citizen walking home at night? This case is not an ending. It is a beginning." The room erupted in applause. Reporters scribbled furiously, but the words were already etched in history. Ripple across the country. The verdict became more than a headline. It became a movement. Across the country, cities lit up with vigils, marches, and celebrations. In New York, the Empire State Building shone in red, white, and blue for the fallen soldiers whose funeral had been interrupted by hate. In Atlanta, veterans marched alongside college students, carrying banners that read, "Justice served, fight continues." Laws began to shift. state legislatures introduced bills to expand the definition of domestic terrorism to include racially motivated violence by law enforcement. Police departments across the nation faced pressure to root out officers with histories of misconduct. For the first time, it seemed possible that accountability could be more than a dream. The backlash. But justice never comes without backlash. Far-right groups erupted in fury. They declared Doyle a martyr, waving his photograph at rallies, calling him a patriot who stood against the system. Online, extremist forums buzzed with talk of retaliation, of taking back the badge. Some police unions grumbled, claiming the verdict was politically motivated. Conservative talk shows painted Doyle the victim of a witch hunt. Yet for every voice of hate, there were thousands louder, clearer, and stronger. The tide had turned, and the majority of Americans refused to let the moment be twisted. A family's healing. Among the crowd who watched the trial unfold were the families of the 3 fallen soldiers whose funeral had been violated. For them, the tragedy had always been double: the loss of their sons and the desecration of their final goodbye. When the verdict was read, one of the mothers, Mrs. Ramirez, wept uncontrollably. She later told a reporter, "My boy gave his life for this country, and on the day I buried him, hate tried to steal that moment. But today, I feel like he's finally at peace, because justice was done, not just for him, but for all of us." Her words spread online, shared millions of times, becoming a reminder that justice, though late, had meaning. The legacy of the verdict. Months passed, but the story did not fade. Documentaries were filmed, universities taught courses analyzing the case. The names of General Marcus Hall and Kent Doyle became etched into the American memory, one as a symbol of courage, the other as a cautionary tale of hate unchecked. Hall himself retired from the military shortly after the trial. He moved into advocacy, creating a foundation for veterans of color who had faced discrimination both in and out of service. His speeches filled stadiums, his voice becoming a bridge between the military, civil rights movements, and the ordinary citizens who longed for a fairer future. A nation reflects. In living rooms and classrooms, families debated the meaning of the trial. Teachers asked their students, "What does justice mean?" Pastors preached sermons about the cost of silence in the face of hate. Veterans wrote letters to newspapers, reflecting on their service and the need to defend freedom not just abroad, but at home. One veteran summed it up simply: "I fought overseas for freedom. General Hall fought in that courtroom for justice. Both are battles we cannot afford to lose." The closing scene.